Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you especially Hanif and George and Mariana for being here presenting their work and their ideas. I mean, I have a text written, and I want to read it. Hanif Kara is a practicing structural engineer in London, director of and co-founder of AKT, previously Adam Kara Taylor, a former diploma unit co-tutor at the Architectural Association and a visiting professor of architectural technology at KTH Stockholm, and is now currently professor in practice of architectural technology at Harvard ISD. Hanif's engagement with the question of organization is dual. As an engineer, his work has championed a design-led approach that has been rewarded with over 250 design awards. My God. But also as co-founder of a structural and civil engineering firm comprised of over 220 people of over 20 different nationalities, communicating in over 30 languages with current and complete projects in 44 countries worldwide. He will understand the pressures of organizing a practice. On both of these levels, the level of design and the level of the structuring of an innovate practice, Hanif has a unique perspective. How are new modes of organization information impacting their design processes? What organizational strategies are critical to building design intensity in large practice? How different or similar are these two branches of organization, which is, I think, the main thing we want to hear him speak about. And George Alexandre, everyone knows him, is a writer, but mainly is an architect based in London too, co-founder of IJP. He's a former visiting professor at ETH Zurich, Princeton University, and the Architectural Association. It seems that nowadays almost everyone in the school has a link with Architectural Association. And is a current associate professor in practice of architecture at Harvard ISD. George's engagement with organization is also dual. Like Hanif, his approach is solidly rooted in information and proceeds through the use of mathematics and quantitative methods. On the other hand, his work maintains a distinctly poetic element that can be seen very clearly in projects such as the well-known The Geometry of Pasta. And I don't know if you know the book on the spaghetti shape that he wrote. It's very successful. While using methods that show a clear yearning for objectivity, there is an opposing pull that seeks to maintain a status of subjectivity. And I am certain that this same tension exists and is abundant in the realm of structural engineering. In the case of Hanif, it's not just a question of architects versus engineers. We are glad to have George and Hanif with us to show some recent projects and to think in abstract terms about the role of the organization of information in their creative work, as an enlargement of the symposium that Mariana has led in the last fall term, and that we are extending a little bit with other interventions, as next week Giovanna Borassi, the curator of the CCA, that will be also speaking with us. So Mariana will be responding them, and you will be invited also to respond and to comment and to make questions. Well, thank you for coming, and please go.
I'm going to try to not do a second introduction to the introduction. So Hanif is going to speak first, and then he's going to be followed by George. I just wanted to say, for those of you that are joining for the first time or that were not part of the symposium in the fall, a little bit of background in the topic. Under Iñaki's leadership as chair of the department, the symposium has been established as a mechanism to identify, discuss, and confront issues that contemporary architecture is facing. The first series focused on the issue of design techniques. It produced several events, 2 symposiums, the publication plus A plus T, which we will have an equivalent one for the issue of organization. And the publication is a combination of the proceedings of the symposium and some other external contributions that we find to be relevant to the topic. So why we decided to focus on organization? As well, everything needs to be organized, materials and people and processes and information. And also because the attempt to define organization has been present in every architectural period. It existed as a pre-digital concern, and it definitely is present today within our highly information-oriented predispositions. I would still argue that organization is not a generic term. That is a term that gets actualized by the contemporary condition. And as we've highlighted before, it is interesting to note that many of today's architectural debates center around the issue of data. But data by itself, I would also argue that there's no pressure in the architectural object or the architectural project. And it is how data is acquired, quantified, manipulated, and evaluated that differentiates outcomes from one another. In the first event, we had 7 presenters. We heard 7 positions. And it was very interesting. The arguments ranged from the death of digital design as we know it to radical mobilizations of infrastructure and structures of knowledge. All the positions asked, or perhaps announced, radical paradigm shifts in the discipline, and all the ideas implying really nothing short of a design revolution. The title of the symposium is posed as a question, as you can see, organizational design with a question mark. Yet we did not ask any of the presenters to take sides, but sides they took. And almost all presenters sided with organization, or at least with the paired terms. So it was curious to me that nobody laid claim on design. So either design is in trouble, or all of our design supporters were present in the Design Techniques Symposium. Iñaki already presented George and Hanif. I think we're lucky to have them. They're both pioneers and innovators within their own work and have contributed not only to the body of work of the built environment, but also to the discourses of the discipline. And I think also there are many reasons why having them together and being able to witness their presentations and conversation is exciting. I think their work is not only stimulating, but they've been in conversation amongst themselves for years, and to get a glimpse of that is always, I would say, a privilege. So with that, just please join me in welcoming Hanif, our first presenter. Okay. George.
Can we just sort the lights out, sir?
Go there so we can see the presentation. I want to see.
Okay, thank you. If I can just start by just confessing, the title, Organization or Design, was changed yesterday. When I bumped into Mariana and George, I had it at Organization and Design. And this is... it's only because they told me that it was actually that. But the talk is actually still about and design. That dichotomy, to me, is probably the crux of the problem in how you separate those two. And as soon as you bring or into it, it becomes schizophrenic, in my opinion, and it's confusing. And that's probably why we've had some response the way we've had in the 2 symposiums that have happened so far. The first thing is to actually frame the question correctly. So in my case, I just read it blindly as organization and design. That's how I'm going to base it. The second thing is I always tend to follow a brief. So I did ask both of them, what do you actually want us to talk about? I did look at the symposium on YouTube, the 2, and as a coincidence, the second one, Paniotis, who worked in my office for 6 or 7 years, and Ciro and I started talking maybe 15 years ago, and some of my thinking goes back to him teaching me, actually. So there's a lot of correlation. Same goes with George. We've all taught and worked together. I thought I'd just set the scene by taking the text that Mariana wrote, because for an engineer, that's always important to understand what people are trying to say first before you jump in with both feet. It's very dense. It's very interesting, and I know Paniotis kind of made some reference to what the author might be thinking when they were writing, but I just narrowed it down to some very key points before I asked them the question of what they want me to talk about. Those points are, what do architects design today? What do architects organize today? These are straight out of the text that Mariana's written. Organization has persisted as a relevant and central question. Design is irreducible to its parts. Organization undermines wholeness. Organization is distinct from design. Dissembling design. I don't know what half of this means, because none of this comes in my life in the daily stuff I do. So I had to try and work it out. The vocabulary of part and whole will come up in the 3 projects I'm going to show. How does a designer participate in organization and design is probably, for me, the most important thing. And the final thing is what Iñaki sent me an email to say, just describe what you do. So that's what I'm going to do. So starting from that position, I thought, okay, if I feel that way about it, what are the things that I think I read out of this? So if you talk about organization and design, for me, you've got to unfold it a lot further. And really, the process and the product that comes out of those things is more important to talk about as a practitioner and as a technologist. The people come into that, and I'll come back to them at the end, but I'll start with the people. So there's process, people, and product. So talking about developing a strategy around people, Iñaki gave me a glowing reference of what we are. One of the beginnings of the thinking of the practice 20 years ago was already from a preformed idea of what engineers do. So we set the scene, and we wanted to communicate a culture which still exists in the organization. People, product, profit is one of our mantras in the office. There is no separation of these three things. It's one and all. We try to work as an organic organization rather than one that's machinic, which is quite different from some engineers. But one of the keys is the bottom right-hand side, in that we predominantly take pride in adding pedagogy and discourse to practice, but then taking practice and pedagogy into construction. So we try to act as that bridge between design and construction, and you have to do everything in order to do that. That requires a certain kind of characteristic. So the family, which is the organization that I have, the average age is about 33. And most of the work is done by Generation Y. They're the creatives in the office. This is the profile of the office. The yellow line is the ladies in the office, and we're not at the target level that we want to get to. But the first strategy that I said then relies on a scientific approach to how we recruit and how we organize that recruitment process, and then how we measure whether it's successful or not, which we will come back to. But it's quite important to be very clear that Generation Y and the next generations are doing all of the work. I do most of the talking. What does that mean? It's very difficult to start to tell you in detail. But what I thought would be good is to do a collective selfie so you get the idea. The thing that Iñaki said, about the office is just normal today. It's just normal that you have 250 people, 37 languages, you're working across 24 hours a day. It's not new. And it affects and includes organization and design within it. What's important about the collective is that it's a demonstration of Generation Y. This is what we end up with. The character of the organization is kind of frail at the edge, so it can engage on the boundaries, which is where everything is happening. The central core is very fixed, although it is difficult to tell what nationality this person might be, whether he's male or female. But actually, the edges are very fragmented. So we tend to use that area between the central core and the outside box, whatever that might be, to do everything we do. The other part of that is the actual space, because it does shape. Churchill said it, and it is true. This is what the office looks like. And when you walk around school, it isn't hugely different from what you do here and what goes on here. This is how the production happens, the physical space. How do we organize the behavior? This is probably the one interesting thing that I have to say, and it's probably slightly different from the other people who spoke on it, is the kind of stuff I talk about is not normative in the discipline of structural engineering. So one of the things we've had to do is learn to try and organize it. How do we capture those frail edges that I talked about from the last slide? How do we capture all the inarticulated desires and influences that we get and create engineering out of it, which is where it drops out of the bottom? How do you organize that? And it's a lecture on its own, all the tools that we have to put in, but I'll just drop a few things in. That behavior today is definitely modeled. So we have a very definite, out of the 250 population in the office, we've boxed it into a situation where we know broadly, who is a computer scientist and how much of that we need, how much data management people we need in the office. We are still trying to design engineering, but there's quite a lot of other people involved in the office. All of them are aiming to create a product. That's the end game. They're not necessarily creating architecture, but they're doing what we do for living. So what does that actually mean? This is a slide that I've used in many of my classes. Why did we do that organization, that system, and the kind of culture that we've created? We noticed 20 years ago, and it's getting worse, that the architect was losing ground to many people. The worst ones, the Engitect and the Archineers. So we could see that there were lots of opportunities in that. And I've said in my classes that this has gone worse and worse. It gets worse. So trying to get back to the left-hand side is what one of the goals is in terms of design and organization. But what actually happens in the office? This is what you see regularly in the office. You saw the people, you saw the space. I took this picture when I was starting to think about it, just as literally as I walked out of one of the rooms, at least 6 computers had this image. So a lot of the work is done through that. A lot of, even the largest computers, and we have some brute force weapons in the office, are often blocked for 3 to 4 hours whilst they're doing organization of data, which we then intuit. That is organized, again, how do you take something as loose as that, and how do you create within that a discipline? So we've created certain blocks that come from that very large volume that I showed you, and then nonlinear processes between these blocks, which I'll demonstrate through work. And my favorite slide, which I use on every lecture, no matter what, because it applies to anything I'm talking about, the future of technology. Because it is something I can confidently talk about. After 20 years of actually pioneering some of the software that we use and driving the industry to it, what I'm coming to today is this: it's so heavy, the ship has lost its compass to some extent. I think that's changing a little bit. There's no doubt that it's binary and without a soul, so we've got to be careful when we're designing that we put some soul into it. Technology has and allows us to be immoral and irresponsible, which is a good thing, because that can create stuff. It removes the need for agency, accountability, and creativity from at least the engineer. We can pretend to be ignoring all of that. You as architects can't. There's a different moral code for you. I noticed in the previous talk that everybody was really talking about BIM. And I thought it would be worth just saying, what the hell does it actually mean to an office? I mean, I don't know what George will say about it, but essentially, we've been doing it from the beginning of the practice. It's just been given a label as it becomes common. It's not doing much. All it's doing is organizing and raising the average at the bottom. It's not the stuff that creates anything. And if you're thinking about it for real, from my eyes, you're all too young to remember the film Crocodile Dundee. Crocodile Dundee made an Australian guy very famous, and there was a moment when the guy with the knife, the little knife, came to attack him. And what he said is, this is a knife, not that one. And really, that's what I think about BIM. BIM, to me, is the little knife, and even often not used well. The reality is you need a much bigger knife to practice today. Before I show you the 3 projects and stop, this is a slide that Panagiotis made when he was in the office, because he was forever banging his head. Because the agency of construction and the discussion, the discourse, what computation people always find is how difficult it is to interoperate. This has been the challenge. How do you create interoperability? And this is not BIM. How do you create discussion, and how do you create buildings out of that? That still stands, although we're getting better at it. And I'm going to show you quickly the projects, just lift the hood of 4 scales, because one of the most important things about this is it's transscalar. So the things I'm talking about apply at master planning level and at the level of designing a door. A very quick project at Colgate University, which is very experimental, with Dewitt Godfrey, who's an artist. Basically, he wanted to create something out of circles. So what do? He is an artist. So he can't even sketch. We start with the sketch. We start with the recipe. We give him something about what it might be, what it could be made of. And then all of those processes that I talked about, we stitched them together. So the office, all sorts of people within the office go through this process of building a tool that will now allow the process of design to take place. So all the easy stuff, which is the computation, there's 4 or 5 steps that we go through, how you manipulate the data through to the end, how do you create fabrication drawings. So if I show you very quickly how that happens in the office, this is Rhino. It's nothing complicated. It's not heavy-end software, but it is essential and necessary to start shaping. We then, in this particular project, it's all about circle packing, which is now a very old thing, but you see that it takes place on those big screens, the analysis models, and we're talking to the artist and the fabricators in parallel all of the time. All of that goes, and the engineering component really is about the modeling. How do we create something that's physically going to react to gravity and the wind forces, aside from the making of it? This is about the only bit of real engineering that we input into that. Most of the rest of it was really geometry and repacking things. So we put a very simple relationship between the circles, then we can start testing and playing with them. You see different ways of defining the relationship between the circles, where it's necessary to do one thing or the other to it, and then test it as well. So you're seeing an optimization process now, which is part of the thick process that we do. And then we respond with the component that we're disciplined to do, which is what do we do as structural engineers? We optimize, we test the material, least weight or most efficient system that will work. And that is done mostly automatically and very fast. And when needed for client purposes usually, because they get, a lot of architects, I'm calling architects clients, believe anything we send them when it moves. So we tend to do these things anyway. But this is the real-time case in this one. And then fine-tuning it. So we talk to the fabricator, get an idea at that point of what is where are the relationships, how do we construct this object, what thicknesses and thinnesses will save money. And then the final step, which I think is beyond BIM. It's just normal. This is what has to happen to create the building, and you don't need to keep labeling it into BIM or anything else. You can automate the process, and it will then go straight to not 3D printing, but actually making this whichever way you choose to make it. So that happens at one scale, and it gets built, very successful, no problems. At another scale, often we're given something that is completely abstract, and we have to wonder how to play with this. This is a rotating car given to us by an artist. His basic sculpture was really, I want this car to turn over 6 times. That's the project. We take that and we go through all of the things, and that yellow line is his squiggle when he came to the office, and he gave us a car physically. So we play around with that and go through all of the processes that I showed you a few minutes ago in order to create the form. I'm going to go faster. I know I'm going to run out of time. In real projects, there are 2 that I just quickly wanted to show you. So at the macro discussion, because one of the things I pulled out of the text was this binding of micro and macro, and it means all sorts of things. I just want to show you 2 very quick ones. So this is a B-spline curve in a very large railway station that we did, where there are 590 pieces of triangular glass that are supported. Each one is different. The macro binding was really about finding what the problem would be and how to solve it. The solution was really very simple. All the tiling is now automated, as I said. But the clever part is actually the engineering, is how do you pick that geometry up and create something that will slide and rotate so that a universal joint can pick up 590 different conditions in a B-spline curve. That is the engineering of the product at the micro level. That doesn't happen by computers. That's the bit that we actually did ourselves and invented. So that then results in something very simple. You see these spiders can pick up almost any spline curve in any curved surface in 2 directions for any joint. The only difficulty was we didn't patent it, and it's been ripped off by a lot of people, but that's okay. So second scale is jumping to building scale. So when you get a very large tower, it's, again, the same processes. It's all of the things I've just gone through at one scale, jumping into a bigger scale. And the last scale is urban, at the scale of city. So one of our clients in Istanbul wanted to do this tower. This is the end product. But in order to do that, we had to go to the place And it's called the Canyon Shopping Center. So what you know, those of you who know Istanbul will know the problem. It's been publicized quite a lot. It was invented as a canyon, which you see on plan there. As soon as it was built, it had a major problem of wind, obviously, because it was a canyon. What would you expect? So when we wanted to put a tower right outside, the shopping center had been closed down straight after construction. There was issues about wind funneling through, natural forces, it's sucking the wind. And the people were really concerned about how to solve this. So one of the challenges to our developer was, you help us solve that and we'll give you a taller tower. So in that situation, that was the city and the developer who owns the canyon, as they call it. So we did a lot of work which splices disciplines, the people who design Formula One cars with Imperial College, with us. So there's a lot of data management and organization going on here. So physical data on site, we put a lot of monitors to see where the wind comes, what time of the year. They had a lot of data. And then we added that to all the different computations at different scales to assess the problem, because sometimes these natural phenomena, when we don't understand them, are so complex, it's difficult to understand what's causing the problem. So we had to compute at weapons grade level in order to get to a point before we could actually get our own project done. So that's a very large scale level, and it's quite common now for the office to get involved at that scale. That's the last project. I want to jump across and finish now. I think it's always very interesting when we're stuck, what we want to say, to look at what other people say. So I was listening to the conversations, and there was a lot of discussion about post-digital, which I never got, because digital was never digital, and post is never post, in my opinion. These things are just, they're flown through, and labeling them is not a good thing. I think Homi Bhabha's book on the location of culture was the most interesting that I found, where he talks about what the edge is and why we are so concerned about it, what is beyond that. It's not just recent history, nor is it actually the horizon, so to speak. But we get stuck in this prefix post-digital or something like that. I think it's very interesting, but it's actually not relevant to what we do. I'm going to finish with what we're doing about it. So in the last 10 years, when computation has kind of gone to the side, we need to go back to rethinking what we're doing. We've collected over the last 10 years, after our first meteoric rise in terms of computational work, and we're going through publishing this year, the last 10 years, to try and understand or explain to people what our thinking is. And funnily enough, Panagiotis and Ciro talked about music. So the first essay in this book is called Pink Noise of Design Engineering, because it's how do you get away from the general noise in order to organize yourself, and how do you actually create a practice. And we're going to do this next, to try and explain to people what we think design engineering might mean. I'm going to finish with people again. So there is no doubt at all that most of and all of the discussion should go back to what the essence of this is. The old Allen curve, which is now 30 years old, still stands even the way we communicate today. So interface, discussion, interdisciplinary conversation, and discourse, you cannot beat it, no matter how many symposiums we have on how many topics. The one thing that transforms, in our opinion, is really that face-to-face conversation or Skyping or designing together in an interdisciplinary way. And what is current in that? It was very difficult without offending architects. So I found over Christmas this new Lady Bird book series, which is very interesting for adults. And I found the hipster. So this is kind of describing what a hipster does. And if I start from the left-hand side slide and just read these out quickly, you can substitute hipster for architect or academic or GSD faculty or whatever you want. But this is what they do. Hipsters like to collect things which are unfashionable. They create sculptures. This is now the socks that can create, for some reason, bespoke sculptures that create a lot of money for them. The hat that the lady is wearing made out of forklift tires, colored balls. This is what we're seeing all over the place. The hipster wants to make a photograph and be seen to be making a chocolate car. They tend to like to find places that have not been spoiled by mainstream culture at all, which I think the first symposium was talking about most of the time. And they like to cook using soup canyons. So I thought there would be a little lightness to what I would finish with, but also bring it back to the school. So last semester, I think there were 2 projects that I had the fortune of being involved in. And both of these, if they were dissected, actually go to the core of the discussion that I was asked to talk about. I don't want to go into the detail. So the final slide is profit. I said people, product, and profit. The elephant in the room is to the right. Nobody ever talks about the money. There's 2 types of profit. We are deliberate about saying that we've won so many awards because that's profit. So we do take pride in winning awards with our collaborators. But to the right, we never forget that it is about making money. That's me.
Yeah, just wanted to take advantage of these seconds before we set up the computer, just to add to the introduction that I am one of the probably 3 to 5 of the awards that you mentioned is me. We have worked together for 10 years. In fact, a lot of the work I'm showing today is engineered by AKT. And given that this is a lunchtime talk of officially 10 minutes, and that we're all very busy, I took the brief very sort of at face value and said, what can I possibly theorize in 10 minutes over lunchtime? I did love the title as such. What it actually does remind me is one of those political slogans of the 1970s, which put things into perspective as a question. Something like Jean-Paul Sartre's socialism of Barbary. And I thought it was a nice blunt way of putting it. So rather than trying to answer the question in a long and winded way, what I decided to do is simply go quickly over a brochure of our office and try to answer the question very abruptly for each given project, organization or design, and maybe in trying to provide an answer, figuring out exactly what those 2 terms mean in our particular context. So first one, definitely organization, Henderson waves. Why? Because it's just completely computed and engineered in a kind of mathematical way. There's no other way you can really do it. The moment I really understood that this was organized versus designed is when I actually realized that this particular model, could not be built as such, because you'd never be able to maintain the steadiness of this particular section. It was just too expensive. And that put paid to the idea that we could build this sort of oversized model that I had originally sort of envisioned. And my partners in Singapore just turned around and said, look, we need to make 50% cost savings. Can you just change that particular rhythm, change the density and stuff? And I said, yeah, sure, I can do it, but only if you allow me to recompute everything, redo the tender package in 6 months and everything. And I never heard from them again. If this had been a building, if this had been a little museum in China, as opposed to Singapore, or even in Singapore, do you really think that this 200-person corporate office with whom I worked wouldn't have just taken the project and then basically implemented those cost cuttings? They would have. But in this case, they didn't. So first conclusion, organization affords you some level of protection, whereas design doesn't. This one, definitely design. And it's a little bit strange that I would say that, because it's got quite a bit of organization. In fact, as you can see in the diagram on the right, this is all the work that I did with the Arab Sustainability Group on trying to get the physics of this particular small building right. The client is rare, right there at the bottom right, you see. And by the way, organization or design, they don't really care. But the fact is that we tried to get the physics right, and eventually they didn't show up. In other words, we could still sense the bats using ultrasound around the structure, but they actually failed to make that ultimate step and come and occupy the structure that we built. So was it perhaps, let's say, over-designed? Was it under-organized? Conclusion, while designing for animals as opposed to humans, you just really don't know what you're doing. Here, I'd say 50-50. 50% organization, 50% design. You can tell the design, you can see the office's sort of, let's say, priorities, that everything should be drawn as a kind of flat pack structure. You can tell this sort of idea that we're pursuing the oversized model through the use of lightweight materials and simple structural solutions. You can probably even tell my age by the sort of fake Foster detail right there, and what I actually like. But the fact is that this is what it's about. It's a table, and it's actually about the tabletop, which is a master plan of what Iñaki mentioned earlier, which is this very abstract relationships that we have between pasta shapes, which is the next project that would say is 50%, actually 100% organization. The problem with this is that if I had actually looked at something like building, I could have retitled the book The Function of Something, okay? But I didn't do that because precisely I'm looking at something that is much more abstract. And the best way to discuss abstraction, in other words, not to bother with, what the long words call the iconicity, in other words, what things look like or what they remind us of, is to just shift the emphasis and look at something that is more abstract. In this case, food, which creates its own problems, but definitely not the kind of theoretical, let's say, issues that we have with architectural treatises. And if you care about the problem of organizing this again, more in space and design, then you can see the exhibition version of that, which is I invited to both curate and design in this sort of fake James Tyrrell way with both the lighting and the shelving and everything. This one, I'd say, for me, 100% organization, also engineered by AKT, like actually probably at least already 5 projects. Why? Because it's all about this middle diagram, just working with light, but working in a way that this curtain is actually carrying everything. In this little project, on-build project for an extension for a museum, it's actually the curtain that carries the walls, the windows, the roof, rather than the other way around. So conclusion, it's nice to try to find a balance. This one, our entry for PS1. Well, I'd say there's 2 ways of looking at it. Most certainly design. However, if I had proposed to build it the way this material study model had basically was demonstrating, in other words, with a rigid material, I would have said it's 100% design. But with Paul Scott of AKT, we went for the real solution, which is to try to get it going with a tensile material, polypropylene rope. In Paul's sort of own comments, this was probably the most sort of irregular, unpredictable structure that you could ever have proposed. And in the light of what Interboro did that year, the winners with a much simpler roof, I think there was a sound of collective relief when we realized that this was probably over-organized for this particular time and budget. Pure organization, 100%. Why? Because it's just looking at this problem, which is what the office does. Unlike the examples that you showed earlier, Hanif, we don't, as you know, we don't send you an idea. We send you an equation, a thought, a process. And in this case, the idea is very abstract, is that what's on the right is unbuildable, what's on the left is buildable. We're trying to somehow pre-rationalize something that would look, let's say, doubly curved. And this is the example, which is right there, made exclusively with a laser cutter, even though it's originally doubly curved. Completely designed. Slight waste of time, and I'll show you where the actual organization kicks in. I have an envy of IKEA. What I mean by that is that as an architect, when I communicate ideas, I'm always accused of being arcane, sort of not clear, self-indulgent, too complicated. But the fact is that on the mass market of popular culture, these guys are getting away with this, which is flat pack instructions, which are beautiful drawings that are so overcomplicated, which makes me long for that kind of freedom. So therefore, a somehow slightly organizationally brain-dead project was simply retrofitted by drawing it like an IKEA flat packaging, which I thought was an interesting idea, even though, of course, it didn't carry the day. 100% organization, a beautiful idea, how you let an uncommon equation describe both the landscape and the building of a single proposal, okay, for a museum in Korea. Very much same idea, pure organization, but this time looking at the problem of structure, again engineered by Hanif, the idea of the 200-meter tall billboard, but in a way that is actually built, and that is not cynically sort of interesting, but actually buildable. Right, this 3 meters wide at the tallest. Design, next. Design, next. This one is probably 50-50. Our own entry for the Guggenheim Museum. Why? Well, I don't actually, because this is a brochure. It's not actually explaining what we do, just showing or reminding the potential client what is actually possible. There was something about this particular proposal that looked at the problem of continuous circulation loop. We're trying to update Frank Lloyd Wright in a certain way. So I would say that it's somehow halfway there. And finally, I'm going to finish with this, which is a very small project we just completed for the London Mathematical Society. It's the idea of organization as design. And the word design means different things to different people. It actually accounts for the fact that the jacket of the pasta book is black, because in the middle of a discussion with marketing at my very commercial publisher, marketing decided that designers were black, and therefore the entire book was rebranded that way. So, conclusion, different words mean different things to different people, and on this particular project, I just looked at this particular problem. It's just that, 30 pieces. It's very close to my heart because it's the way we work, the idea that you actually write form, and also that in doing so, you resist the iconicity of what people call computer work, parametric whatever, blobs and things. By working with something that is sort of iconically different, that means the same to everyone, you know, in this case, a sort of double-pitched house. And creating a number of objects which actually are eventually design themselves. You can see our first foray into what the person on the street would actually call design as opposed to ourselves. And finally, looking at sort of creating prototypes one-to-one for this particular furniture. I don't actually really have any conclusion, but going through those very, very quick points, I did my best to try to answer for myself and maybe formulating some more general concepts as to, you know, how you actually divide the two terms that you put forward in your symposium in the work of IJP. Thanks for everything. Yeah.
Sit in the middle. So thank you for the presentations, as inspiring as I imagine they would be. First, I would say that I love that you presented the project mathematically in confronting the terms, but I also take very seriously Hanif's critique, not only of the title, but also of the desire or need of architects to label things. I think that, in a sense, is fair in an academic environment when we're trying to communicate knowledge and teach. And I'm trying to imagine alternative ways in which, without the labeling or the establishing relationships with our lineages, we can otherwise do it. And perhaps it's an entire model based on how that knowledge gets processed and communicated that doesn't require those type of activities. I just don't know what that would be yet. But perhaps in the same way that the projects have advanced and the technologies have advanced, maybe the ways in which we process that knowledge would advance as well, and there would be a more modern or contemporary way of doing that. So having said that, I think it's also interesting the question of time. I think both of you presented work that is contemporary, but argued that you've been doing this for a very long time. And I think without having that body of work, it's very difficult to reflect on it. So the fact that now it all exists as a collection allows us to see that even the work that you were doing 20 years ago might have had the same spirit, but either technological advancement or your own personal evolutions have made the project evolve as well. So I think for me, one of the interesting things were beyond the descriptions of a particular practice or the process for one project was how this idea of organization or design, posed as a question and not necessarily as something you need to choose from, enables certain projects. In the same way that BEAM had existed conceptually, but now the technology supports other projects, so it's the projects that these ideas might enable. And as I said, I don't know if this is more a retrospect, a look to the past, or if it's a moment of transition where we need to shift gears towards the future. So that was a very short intro, and perhaps the question is, are there tendencies Are we finishing something and starting something else? Are we in a continuum? Is it useless to try to distinguish it? Interesting, not interesting? Do you see this within your own methods, or can you reflect it on the work of others?
I think it is a continuum. I think I tried to articulate it using a much more intelligent quote from Homi Bhabha than one I could make. But personally, I believe, if I didn't get it across, is that at least from the work we're doing, everything you said is right. I don't think we've changed enormously, even though the conditions keep changing as rapid urbanization comes or we have an economic crash. Most of those things just reorganize the practice and what we might want to do as a practice. But the work itself and how we undertake the work, whether we're looking at old buildings or new ways of making things or whatever, still comes through the people and the way we've tried to create a culture that creates a certain kind of character that's involved in the engineering of design or design aspects of engineering. So for us, so far, it's been a continuum. And I would say, looking to the outside, and I know it's a very difficult conversation because there are some very good symposiums going on practice and this one here. But looking to the side of all those big practices that are building or not building all over the world, those that are typecast or just saying, okay, today we must think about green technologies. 10 years ago we were doing technology, and then next week we'll think about how we do renderings. Those are the practices that I feel are failing the most. Many of or much of the work that I see, certainly, the good thinkers are going through the continuum and just adapting to the problem they're given, which I think is the essence of the architect, as in capital A. And we should stop getting schizophrenic about labeling these things. That would be my take.
Sure. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'd say at a personal level, having, at a time sort of made a living by being a card-carrying design technologist, being hired, for this or that particular sort of skill, I would say things are shifting very fast. I certainly don't feel that I understand the cutting edge, let's say, as well as I did maybe 10 years ago. But that is just a software issue, which, is by nature sort of constantly evolving. At the level of, the design sort of methodology and strategies, I would say that if you operate at the meta level, to use another long word, in other words, if you're looking at a kind of what is common to the languages of all these technologies, in other words, the kind of mathematical underpinning, and you're choosing to look at the problem from this very low level, as opposed to maybe just investing all of your knowledge and effort into the sort of intuitiveness of this or that particular package, then things are relatively stable. I mean, I've had nice breakthroughs, one of them maybe 4 years ago in this building, when my TA at the time, John, sort of came up with, in a way, a translation of some tools from the old languages into the, the contemporary ones. And for me, it gave us another lease of life, even though, of course, the underlying processes are the same. And so there's been a few shifts, but fundamentally it's very stable, and I think that's how it should be. I agree with Hanif. If you live by technology, you also die by technology as a practice, and you have to be a little bit careful about that. I can't be accused of somehow changing my mind every other year, though. So in that sense, I'm completely fine.
I just wanted to add one thing, because I did want to say that, I didn't talk about the 2 student projects from last semester, because I'm sure everybody's bored with how much has been talked about. But the key to those, what I drew out of that, is how bad architects are at organizing. So the project management of those, and if there was more effort put into, I'm talking project level, into understanding that you cannot separate design from having to make it, or having to secure it, or having to get paid for it. You can't just come up with a great idea that makes sense for quality of life and then leave it at that. And I learned even at that student level, I think they were very successful projects that, because they put them up, you could still see this flaw in a basic understanding of how you organize yourself and the client.
I think that's precisely, even though you often insist in asking why is it interesting for us to hear about how your practice is organized, it's precisely because of that, because we still need to learn and hear it. So maybe I'll open it to the floor. I'm sure we'll have a microphone circling around.
I'll follow up on the position made by Hanif on implementing design, and pick one of your maybe findings from what you presented on the boat with technology, that it allows you, or the practitioners, to be morally responsible. If we leave morality out of the discussion, for an engineer to say that responsibility is relieved by the evolution of technology is, for me as an architect, striking. Is that, how would you balance that? Is that, would the software solve everything, assuming that, other disciplines around you, the designer, maybe, all the others, consultants that you have, may be lacking some of that experience to implement. How is that balance between advancement of software and responsibility playing out in what you see? I mean, is it an issue of design, organization, or how it is?
I think it's, in all honesty, I think it's a question of design. I think technology can do almost anything today, almost anything, and beyond what we want or need. The question of design then comes in the asking why. Why do you want to do that, and why do you want to do it like this rather than like that, or not like this, whatever. So I think design gives it a purpose, and if you go in, it's very difficult because the way, because we work together a long time, the way architects might perceive what design means and what we perceive what design means is different. But where we're common is that it's impossible to value it. We're common, and that most of our audience doesn't think it should cost anything to have a better design. I think we would agree that we undersell the value we create through that moment, which isn't technological. It's the intervention that was made by the education you had, or some experience in life, or something like that, that makes the great designer. That's my opinion. I think most machines today can design quite well. So, a good BIM from HOK or SOM will do, usually, but that's not what I'm talking about.
Question. I would like to have a question that relates both practices in a way. When Hanif got the position he has now in the GSD, he was like months trying to figure out what could be his legacy while in this school, till he found the issue of recycling and the issue of waste as the one that he's dealing with now, no, in studio and seminars, and I was like, it was curious for me I couldn't expect this kind of topic coming from you, because in a way the first thing I thought it was that it was a kind of 100% organic process of entropic processes, etc., and was, could be understood under the prism of let's say biomimicry, but I don't see you in this at all, or it was not a stylistic approach. So I haven't still understood quite well how do you relate the issue of organization, design, and waste? These three things are in your mind. I don't mean in practical terms. So, which thing allow you in one moment to say that this is the thing I want to research on? And in the case of George in the school, in the optional studios of this school, represents the other side of the, let's say, more guided by numeric, I would say numeric or mathematical methods in the studios we are dealing with these last years. The other side of Achim Menges. I would say. I mean, I see it at least as one very much based in mathematics, pure mathematics, and the other much more based again in this kind of vague organism and seen under the prism of fabrication and fibers, basically. So I just want to ask you George, how do you relate and differentiate yourself from the practices of Hachim? That should be another one in this table. I mean, just to complete the portrait of what we are dealing with in the school with organization and design.
Well, I have, it's an interesting one. I have reflected on that for quite a while, actually. You know, Hakim and I go back a long way. We used to argue a lot at the AA, but without actually being able to put it into words. You know, for a long time I thought it had something to do with the German sort of Hegelian take on architecture. You know, they kept saying, but it's visual, you know, it's visual, it's visual. He kept repeating, and I was trying to understand what he was getting at. And it's only later that I think I've actually made that quite clear in some of the conversations we had in the seminar here at the GSD. Hakim is an empiricist. You know, he just bangs around the material to figure out exactly what's happening, like Shin Egashira used to do at the AA. I mean, these were the material empiricists, you know, which is a kind of an uncharted territory because it requires you to re-examine the material year in, year out to actually put together conclusions. Whereas I came to it from the opposite side of the table, in a way, the kind of rational approach. And by rational, I mean literally rational, as in making it up. You see, I used to sort of explain that maybe in relation to Shin more than Shin Egashira, more than Hakim Menges. Shin's position and Hakim's position is that they're actually trying to make something out of something. Whereas, you know, I was always trying to make something out of nothing. Okay, in other words, I would begin with a number of, you know, there's a very technical description possibly of how we get to that same point, but imagine that we're approaching from two opposite ends. And I think that the process obviously is not as black and white. There's a lot of stuff that Hakim does. The computational part is in fact rational and would be along the lines of some of the most syntactic mathematical approaches that I foster. And in my own way, the way I approach this subject matter as material, because it's unknown, and that's certainly the case of the absolute beginners with whom I used to work here on these particular problems. There is an unknown quality that you have to bang on until it actually starts making sense. And that too is a material experimentation. The raw material is symbolic as opposed to being material, but it's somehow equally unknown and needs to be approached in this experimental way. Okay, so I'd say we're actually very similar, although from the standpoint of epistemology, you know, with the history of sciences, we're actually evil twins. Okay, he gets to it from that end, and I get to it from this one.
I mean, going back to that point first, I was fortunate enough to be at the AA when they were arguing, and the position I take in all of these things was I learned a lot, and the point I want to make about that is the practice started at the same time as my engagement with education. So now it's actually difficult to know which bit was done at school. What's very certain is that it all started at school, and it has to many ways. But in those arguments, the position I would take is to make each one better, rather than change either or redesign them in one way or the other. Going to waste, that's a completely parallel and short-term thought, and that thought has come from initially here, there was a discussion about Frank Gehry starting from waste, his first house. And it was really supposed to be part of that symposium. But the waste research that we're doing, which is literally to do with waste, is from a design perspective, because what I'm struggling is how to get interdisciplinary discourse into a school where architecture dominates or urban design dominates. You know, and what does that interdisciplinary discourse mean? And the type that we're studying and the subject of waste was one of the best examples, in my view, of bringing disciplines together, whether we like it or not. And most of all, the weakest aspect of that is the substance of aesthetics and the value of aesthetics today. It's actually nothing to do with the research we're doing, but that's what motivated it, is that most of those types of buildings are ugly, period. It doesn't matter who's looking at them. So why is that a problem? Why have we let that happen? Why is it happening? So it comes from that waste of how we make ourselves well by looking at more beautiful things as a motivation and finding something that will possibly in 3 years give us a starting point to engage. It's nothing, a subject you know well. So I know there's a lot of politics and corruption and all sorts in that world, but the idea is to try and get a design discussion out of it.
I just wanted to say something about the topic, actually, organization or design, because I read the essay, not as diligently as Hanif. I didn't watch the YouTube video. But of course, I was very curious, and it seems to me that where I would draw the line, in some ways, having not been party to that first conversation, is that everything we do, I suppose the most important is to articulate it to others. Okay, we do things, but really it's about communicating them to others. And I think there's two conversations going on. There is one among ourselves. Okay, this is the internal one. It's me to you, and there is one with the rest of the world, at which Hanif is particularly successful. In other words, taking your concerns out to not just clients and project managers and things, but the world at large. And it seems to me that where I draw the line is, it seems to me that if you can articulate very clearly, if you can actually explain what you're doing to your peers, for me, you are within the organizational paradigm. The projects that I somehow skipped there, saying design next, I was simply trying to say that actually I can't tell you what they are about, other than they are probably attractive or responding to this particular side of the brief, appropriate to the site, within budget. I mean, all of those things would be the case because, we are very conscientious and professional. But I wouldn't be able to talk about them in this context. There's nothing that I could share about them in this particular context. Outside, I may tell a client that, it's cost-effective, it's nice, it has a high net worth, you could make money out of it, will you please give me the contract? That's a different, cynical, perhaps, but also very sort of practical discourse. So that's where I draw the line. If I am able, in a way, to tell you what I am doing, I would consider that I operate within the paradigm of organization. If I can't, I'm just designing.
Yeah, I want to actually let that be the end because I'm not going to be able to top it. But I do want to say that I was also lucky to be at the AA at that time as a student. Though, hopefully I learned from it, or at least I'm pretty sure that it definitely had an enormous impact of how I operate both as a designer and as an academic. So somehow the motivations that generated some of these questions are related to this confrontation or pairing of empiricism and rationality that today seem to be very present in a different duality, which is the scientific or the aspiration for precision and subjectivity. And I think, Hanif, when you talk about that extra value, that goes beyond the mastery of technology, I think is basically the result of our subjectivity, our talents, and our sort of visions as an architect and the relationship between the two. So maybe that's another way to place the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.